Margaret Walsh had been scanning groceries at Riverside Grocery Store for longer than most of the current employees had been alive. 37 years, to be exact. She'd started working there when the store was half its current size, when scanners didn't exist and every price had to be typed in by hand. Now, at 72 years old, her fingers weren't as quick as they used to be. Arthritis had started creeping into her knuckles about 5 years back, making those long shifts at the register a bit more challenging. But she never complained, not once. This job wasn't just about the paycheck for Margaret. It was about the people. Every morning she'd wake up at 5:30 in her small one-bedroom apartment 3 blocks away from the store. The place wasn't much to look at. The wallpaper had yellowed over the years and the heater made funny noises in the winter. But it was home. It had been home for her and her late husband Robert for 40 years. And even though he'd been gone for 8 years now, she could still feel him there in the quiet moments. She'd make herself a simple breakfast, usually oatmeal with a bit of honey, maybe a banana if they were on sale the week before. Then she'd put on her uniform, that polyester vest that never quite seemed to fit right, pin her name tag on and walk those 3 blocks to work. Rain or shine, snow or heat, Margaret made that walk. The thing about working as a cashier for that long is you start to recognize people, not just their faces but their stories. Margaret knew Mrs. Chen always bought the same brand of tea. She knew that young Tommy Rodriguez loved the chocolate chip cookies from the bakery section, and his mom always pretended to resist before giving in. She knew Mr. Patterson had diabetes and was trying hard to avoid the candy aisle, so she'd always give him an encouraging smile when he managed to walk past it. These weren't just customers to Margaret. They were her community, her family in a way. She'd watched kids grow up, seen couples get married, consoled people during hard times. The register had become more than just a workplace. It was her window into the lives of her neighbors. On this particular Thursday, the rain was coming down hard. The kind of rain that makes you want to stay in bed with a hot cup of tea and a good book. But Margaret had never called in sick. Not in all those years, and she wasn't about to start now. The store needed her, and besides, she actually looked forward to going to work most days. The morning shift had been busy. Thursdays always were, with people stocking up before the weekend. Margaret's feet were starting to hurt a bit, and she'd already helped about 60 customers by her count. Each one got the same warm smile, the same gentle, "How are you doing today?" that she'd been offering for decades. Around 2 in the afternoon, the lunch rush had died down. The store was quieter now, just a handful of shoppers wandering the aisles. Margaret was restocking bags under her register when she noticed someone approaching her lane. The woman was impossible not to notice. She wore a cream-colored coat that looked softer than anything Margaret had ever touched. Probably cashmere, she thought. The woman's heels clicked sharply against the tile floor, and her handbag looked like it cost more than Margaret's entire month's rent. Margaret straightened up and smiled. "Good afternoon," she said warmly, just like she did with everyone else. The woman barely glanced at her. She was too busy tapping away at her phone with long, perfectly manicured nails. Each nail was painted a delicate shade of pink, and Margaret noticed a diamond ring on her finger that caught the fluorescent lights and threw little rainbows across the register. The groceries started coming down the belt. Organic vegetables, fancy cheeses Margaret had never tried. Imported crackers, a bottle of wine with a French name she couldn't pronounce. Margaret scanned each item carefully, her arthritic fingers moving as quickly as they could manage. The woman, still on her phone, pulled out a sleek credit card, one of those heavy metal ones that Margaret had heard about but rarely saw. She tapped it against the card reader without even looking up from her screen. The machine beeped. It wasn't the friendly beep that meant a successful transaction. It was the sharp, disapproving beep that Margaret had learned to recognize over the years. Margaret said gently. "Let's try that again, dear." The woman finally looked up from her phone, a slight frown crossing her face. She tapped the card again, this time with a bit more force, as if the machine was simply being stubborn. Another beep. Declined. The woman's expression changed. Her cheeks flushed slightly and her jaw tightened. But it wasn't embarrassment that Margaret saw in her eyes. It was anger. "This is absolutely ridiculous," the woman said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Your machine is obviously malfunctioning." Margaret kept her voice calm and kind. "Sometimes these things happen, dear. Maybe we can try inserting the chip instead." "I know how to use a credit card," the woman snapped. I've been using credit cards since before you probably started working here. That stung a bit, but Margaret didn't let it show. She'd dealt with difficult customers before. Everyone has bad days, she reminded herself. That's what Robert used to tell her whenever she came home frustrated. Everyone's fighting a battle you know nothing about, Maggie, he'd say. Behind the woman, a line was starting to form. An elderly man with just a carton of milk, a young mother with a toddler in the cart, a teenager buying energy drinks. They all watched the scene unfolding with that particular kind of discomfort that comes from witnessing someone else's frustration. The woman tried her card 3 more times. Each beep seemed to make her angrier. She pulled out her phone and started stabbing at it with her finger, probably checking her banking app. "Do you know who I am?" the woman said suddenly, looking at Margaret as if seeing her for the first time. "I'm Victoria Ashford. My husband owns the Ashford properties downtown. We own half the commercial buildings in this city." Margaret nodded politely. She had no idea who the Ashford family was, but it clearly mattered to this woman. "That's wonderful, dear. But I still need a way to pay for these groceries. Would you like me to hold them while you sort this out?" Victoria's eyes swept over Margaret. Really looked at her for the first time. Margaret could almost feel the judgment. The yellowing polyester vest, the sensible shoes worn thin at the heels, the name tag that was slightly crooked because the pin had broken years ago and she'd fixed it with tape. "Someone like you wouldn't understand," Victoria said, her voice dripping with something cold. "I have an important charity luncheon in 20 minutes. I'm supposed to be bringing the artisan cheeses. This is completely unacceptable." The words hit Margaret harder than she expected. Someone like you, as if working an honest job, treating people with kindness, living a simple life made her somehow less than. As if the value of a person could be measured in the price of their coat or the weight of their credit card. Margaret looked at the total on her screen. $47.83. She thought about her own bank account. The money she'd been saving up to replace her worn-out winter coat. The small amount she set aside each month for emergencies. Then she thought about Robert and what he would do. She thought about the kind of person she'd always tried to be. And she made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Margaret reached into her pocket and pulled out her own worn leather wallet. It was the same wallet Robert had given her on their 20th anniversary. The leather was cracked now, faded from years of use, but she'd never replaced it. She pulled out her debit card. It wasn't one of those fancy metal ones, just plain plastic with her name printed on it in simple letters. "I'll take care of this," Margaret said quietly, sliding her card into the reader. For a moment, the entire line went silent. Even the toddler in the shopping cart stopped squirming. Everyone was staring at Margaret like she'd just done something completely crazy. Victoria's mouth actually fell open. What are you doing?" "Paying for your groceries, dear," Margaret said, punching in her PIN number. Her fingers trembled slightly, and she wasn't entirely sure if it was from the arthritis or from what she was doing. That was nearly $50. That was her grocery budget for the week. That was the money she'd been saving to finally replace those shoes that pinched her toes. The machine beeped. Approved. Margaret printed the receipt and handed it to Victoria along with her bags. "There you go. You said you had somewhere important to be." Victoria just stood there holding the bags like they weighed 1,000 pounds. She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. "I don't—" "Why would you?" Her voice had changed. That sharp cutting edge was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like confusion, maybe even shame, though Margaret couldn't be sure. "Someone like me?" Victoria said, and this time it was a question, not an insult. She was looking at Margaret differently now, really seeing her. The lines around her eyes from decades of smiling. The sensible gray hair pulled back in a practical bun. The hands that had worked for 37 years to help people day after day. Margaret just smiled. The same warm, genuine smile she gave everyone. "Have a lovely day, dear. I hope your luncheon goes well." Victoria stood there for another moment, then gathered her bags close to her chest. "I'll send you a check," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll come back and I'll pay you back, I promise." "No need for that," Margaret said, already turning to the next customer. "Just remember to be kind to the next person who might need it. That's payment enough." Victoria walked toward the door, but Margaret noticed she kept looking back. Once, twice, 3 times, as if she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. The young mother who'd been waiting in line stepped forward, but she wasn't looking at her groceries. She was looking at Margaret with tears in her eyes. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," she whispered. Margaret felt her cheeks warm. "Oh, it was nothing, really." "It wasn't nothing," the elderly man behind her said firmly. "That took real kindness, real courage." The teenager with the energy drinks was recording something on his phone. "That was amazing," he said. "Just amazing." Margaret waved them all off and kept working. But inside, her heart was pounding. What had she just done? That was real money. Money she needed. Bills didn't pay themselves, and Social Security only stretched so far. Her coworker Jenny appeared at her side during the next lull. Jenny was 26, studying accounting at the community college at night while working at the store during the day. She'd been there for 3 years, and Margaret had taken her under her wing from day one. "Maggie," Jenny said, her voice tight, "why did you do that? That woman was horrible to you. And that money? You need that money." Margaret looked at her young friend and saw genuine distress in her eyes. Sweet Jenny, who brought her homemade soup when she had a cold, who offered to drive her home on rainy days. "My mama used to tell me something," Margaret said, straightening a stack of receipts. "She said you never know what battles people are fighting behind their eyes. That woman could have been having the worst day of her life, and I had no way of knowing." "But she was so rude to you," Jenny insisted. "She treated you like you were beneath her." "Maybe," Margaret agreed. "Or maybe she was scared and angry and didn't know how to handle it. Pride makes people do funny things, Jenny. It makes them put up walls and say things they don't mean." Jenny shook her head. "You're too good, Maggie. Too good for this world sometimes." Margaret laughed, a soft sound that made the tension ease from Jenny's shoulders. "I'm not good, honey. I'm just old enough to know that holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to get sick. Life's too short for that." "But your winter coat," Jenny said quietly. "You've been saving for months." "I'll manage," Margaret said, and she meant it. She'd always managed somehow. Besides, coats can wait. That woman needed kindness more than I needed a new coat. What Margaret didn't know, couldn't know, was what was happening in the parking lot at that very moment. Victoria Ashford sat in her luxury car, a sleek black vehicle that cost more than most people made in a year. The engine wasn't running. The imported cheeses and organic vegetables sat in bags on the passenger seat. And Victoria was crying. She couldn't remember the last time she'd cried. Maybe at her wedding 15 years ago, but those had been happy tears, carefully managed tears that wouldn't ruin her makeup. These tears were different. They were hot and angry and confused, and they wouldn't stop coming. Her phone buzzed. Another call from her lawyer. The third one that morning. She let it go to voicemail just like the others. That morning had started like any other Thursday. She'd woken up in her king-sized bed in their 6-bedroom house on the hill. She'd done her usual workout with her personal trainer. She'd planned the charity luncheon she was supposed to be at right now. And then her husband had walked into the kitchen with divorce papers. Not just divorce papers. He'd frozen their joint accounts. All of them. Overnight, without warning. Their lawyer said it was perfectly legal, that he'd protect his assets during the proceedings. Said she'd have access to her own money soon, but right now everything was locked down. Victoria had gone to the grocery store in a daze. She needed those cheeses for the luncheon. She was the co-chair. She couldn't show up empty-handed. She'd grab the groceries, deal with the marriage crisis later. Except her card didn't work. And suddenly, standing in that grocery store being judged by people in line, it all became real. Her perfect life was falling apart. Her husband was leaving. The money she'd never had to think about was suddenly unreachable, and she'd taken it all out on a kind old woman who'd done nothing wrong. A kind old woman who'd then paid for her groceries. Victoria looked at those bags on her seat. That elderly cashier had probably used her own grocery money, or her medication money, or whatever small amount people like her had saved up, and she'd done it without hesitation, without judgment. After being treated terribly, "Someone like you," Victoria whispered to her empty car, remembering her own words. What kind of person had she become? When had wealth and status become more important than basic human decency? She thought about the cashier's words. Just remember to be kind to the next person who might need it. The next person who might need it. But Victoria was the one who needed it. She'd needed that kindness more than she could express, more than she'd even realized in the moment. She'd been drowning in fear and pride, and that woman had thrown her a lifeline. Victoria pulled out her phone and checked her personal account, the one she'd opened years ago with money from her grandmother. It was modest by her standards, but it was hers. Untouched. Available. She should drive to that luncheon. She was already late. The other board members would be wondering where she was. But somehow, sitting in that parking lot with tear-streaked makeup and bags of groceries paid for by a stranger's kindness, the luncheon seemed less important than it had an hour ago. Her whole life seemed different than it had an hour ago. Back inside the store, Margaret's shift continued. Customers came and went. Groceries were scanned. Pleasant conversations were had. To anyone watching, it was just another ordinary Thursday afternoon at Riverside Grocery. But Jenny couldn't stop thinking about what she'd witnessed. During their break, she told Carlos, the stock boy, who told his manager, who mentioned it to the afternoon shift. By the time Margaret clocked out at 6, the whole store had heard about what she'd done. Some people thought she was crazy. Some thought she was a saint. Some just shook their heads at the kindness of it all. Margaret didn't hear any of it. She just collected her purse from her locker, waved goodbye to her co-workers, and started her 3-block walk home. The rain had stopped, leaving everything wet and clean-smelling. Her feet hurt. Her hands ached. And her bank account was nearly $50 lighter than it should have been. But somehow, walking those familiar blocks toward her small apartment, Margaret felt lighter than she had in weeks. 3 days passed before Victoria returned to Riverside Grocery. She'd told herself she was being ridiculous, that she should just mail a check and be done with it. But something kept pulling her back to that store. To that cashier. To that moment that had somehow cracked something open inside her. She dressed differently this time. No cashmere coat, just a simple sweater and jeans. She felt exposed without her usual armor of expensive clothes and designer labels, but she forced herself to walk through those automatic doors anyway. The store was busy for a Sunday afternoon, families doing their weekly shopping, elderly couples moving slowly through the aisles. Victoria made her way to the checkout lanes, scanning for the cashier. Margaret. Her name had been Margaret according to the crooked name tag, but Margaret wasn't there. A teenage boy was working her usual register. Victoria felt her stomach drop with disappointment she didn't quite understand. "Excuse me," she said to the boy. "Is Margaret working today?" He looked up from his phone. "Margaret? Oh, you mean Maggie? Nah, she works Monday through Friday. She'll be in tomorrow." Tomorrow. Victoria nodded and left, feeling foolish. What was she doing? Why did it matter so much? That night she barely slept. The divorce proceedings were moving forward. Her lawyer kept calling. Her soon-to-be ex-husband was being difficult about everything. Her friends had started taking sides, and Victoria realized with a sinking feeling that most of them had been his friends first. The big house felt empty and cold. In the darkness of her bedroom, she kept thinking about that grocery store, about Margaret's hands weathered and marked by years of work, about her gentle smile, about the way she'd helped without expecting anything in return. Monday morning came slowly. Victoria found herself at the grocery store at 10 o'clock, feeling nervous in a way she hadn't felt in years. The automatic doors opened, and there she was, Margaret at her register, helping a woman with a cart full of items. Victoria waited in line even though there were other registers open. She needed to talk to the specific person. When her turn came, Margaret looked up with that same warm smile. There was no recognition in her eyes at first. Why would there be? She probably helped hundreds of people every week. "Good morning, dear," Margaret said. "How are you today?" Victoria's carefully prepared speech disappeared from her mind. "You don't remember me," she said. Margaret tilted her head, studying her face. Then something clicked. "Oh, you're the young woman from Thursday, with the fancy cheeses." "I wasn't very kind to you," Victoria said, the words rushing out. "I was horrible, actually. I said terrible things, and you still helped me. Why did you do that?" Margaret's smile didn't waver. "We all have hard days, dear. I could see you were struggling with something." "But you used your own money," Victoria insisted. "Money you probably needed. For someone who treated you like garbage." Several people in line behind Victoria were starting to notice the conversation. Margaret seemed unbothered by the audience. "Money comes and goes," Margaret said simply. "Kindness is what sticks with people." Victoria pulled an envelope from her purse. "I brought you a check. $500. It's not enough, really, but I wanted to." Margaret gently pushed the envelope back. "I told you, no need for that." "Please, Victoria said, and her voice cracked slightly. Please let me do this. You don't understand. That day, that moment, it was... She paused, aware of the people listening. Could we talk somewhere private? Margaret glanced at the line. I'm working until 3, dear. But my afternoon break is at 1:30 if you want to wait around. Victoria nodded. She bought a few random items just to have a reason to be there, and then spent the next few hours wandering the store. She found herself really looking at it for the first time. The worn tile floors, the fluorescent lights that hummed slightly, the handwritten price tags in the produce section, the bulletin board by the entrance with community announcements and lost pet flyers. This was Margaret's world. This ordinary, everyday place where she'd spent 37 years of her life. And she seemed happy, genuinely happy. Victoria couldn't remember the last time she'd felt that kind of contentment. At 1:30, Margaret clocked out for her break. She found Victoria waiting by the entrance and gestured for her to follow. They walked outside to a small bench near the shopping cart return. So, Margaret said, sitting down with a small sigh, what's on your mind? Everything came pouring out. The divorce, the frozen accounts, the humiliation of having her card declined, the charity luncheon she never made it to, the realization that her entire identity had been built on her husband's money and status, the loneliness, the fear, all of it. Margaret listened without interrupting. She just sat there, her worn hands folded in her lap, her eyes kind and understanding. When Victoria finally ran out of words, Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke. You know, when my Robert died 8 years ago, I thought my life was over. We'd been together since we were 18 years old, married for 51 years. I didn't know how to be a person without him. Victoria looked at her, really looked at her. She'd made so many assumptions about this woman, about her life being simple, easy somehow. She'd never considered that Margaret might have faced her own heartbreak. How did you get through it? Victoria asked. One day at a time, Margaret said, and by helping other people. That's when I learned something important. When you're feeling broken, helping someone else helps you heal too. It reminds you that you still have something to give, that your life still has purpose. I don't know how to help people, Victoria admitted. I've been so focused on charity galas and fundraising events, but I realize now I never actually got my hands dirty. I never really saw the people we were supposedly helping. Margaret patted her hand. Well, now you know, and knowing is the first step. They sat there for a while longer, talking about everything and nothing. Margaret told stories about her years at the grocery store, the regular customers who became friends, the young people she'd watched grow up, the community that had formed around this ordinary place. Victoria told Margaret about her grandmother, who'd been a teacher in a small town. The only person in her family who'd never cared about money or status. The one who'd told her years ago that real wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts. She sounds wise, Margaret said. She was, Victoria agreed. I wish I'd listened to her better. When Margaret's break was over, Victoria walked her back inside. At the door, she stopped. Can I come back? She asked. Not to give you money or anything, just to talk sometimes. Margaret's face lit up. I'd like that very much, dear. Over the next few weeks, Victoria became a regular visitor. She'd come during Margaret's lunch break and they'd sit on that bench and talk. Sometimes about serious things, sometimes about nothing at all. Margaret would bring sandwiches from home and share them. Victoria would bring coffee from the fancy place down the street. Through these conversations, something shifted in Victoria. She started noticing things she'd never paid attention to before. The exhausted single mother counting pennies at the register. The elderly man buying the cheapest cat food. The teenager nervously applying for a job at the store. One day she asked Margaret, "How do you stay so positive? After everything you've been through, after years of hard work for modest pay, how do you keep smiling?" Margaret thought about this for a long moment. You know, I could be bitter. I could focus on what I don't have. The fancy house on the hill, the exotic vacations, the financial security. But I've got something better. I've got purpose. Every person I help at that register, every kind word I offer, every smile I give, that's real. That matters. Money can't buy that kind of richness. Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. I've been so empty, she whispered. My whole life I've been chasing things that don't matter. Then chase different things, Margaret said simply. It's never too late to change direction. That night, Victoria made a decision. She enrolled in community college. Social work. She wanted to help people going through what she'd gone through. Women facing divorce, financial crisis, identity loss. She wanted to be for them what Margaret had been for her in that moment at the grocery store. It wasn't easy. Her former friends thought she'd lost her mind. Her ex-husband laughed when he heard. The classes were hard and she was older than most of the other students. But every time she felt like quitting, she thought about Margaret, about those worn hands that had worked for decades, about that smile that never wavered, about the choice to help when it would have been easier to turn away. Margaret became her anchor, her inspiration, her reminder that kindness costs nothing but means everything. And through it all, Margaret just kept doing what she'd always done. Showing up, scanning groceries, offering smiles and warm words, being herself, not knowing that her small act of kindness had set off a chain reaction that would change everything. 3 years passed like pages turning in a well-loved book. Slowly at first, then faster as the story gained momentum, Margaret had finally retired. The arthritis in her hands had gotten worse, making those long shifts at the register increasingly painful. On her last day at Riverside Grocery, the staff threw her a small party. There was cake from the bakery section and a card everyone had signed. Jenny cried. Even some of the regular customers stopped by to say goodbye. Margaret cried too, though she tried not to. That store had been her second home for nearly 4 decades. Those people had been her family. But her body was telling her it was time to rest, and she'd learned long ago to listen to what her body needed. Now, at 75, she lived on Social Security and Robert's modest pension. It was enough, barely. She'd given up her car to save on insurance and gas. She clipped coupons. She bought generic brands. She wore the same clothes year after year. But she was okay. She had her small apartment, her health, and her memories. Most days she volunteered at the community center. She'd help with the senior lunch program, organizing meals and chatting with people who were often even lonelier than she was. It gave her purpose. It kept her connected to people. It reminded her that she still had something to give. She'd lost touch with Victoria. Not intentionally. It just happened the way these things do. Victoria had gotten busy with school, then with her new job. Their regular coffee dates became monthly, then occasional, then stopped altogether. Margaret understood. Life moves forward. People drift apart. It didn't diminish what they'd shared. Sometimes she thought about that day at the grocery store. The day she'd paid for a stranger's groceries. It seemed like such a small thing now, looking back. $47.83. But she'd never regretted it. Not once. On a Tuesday morning in October, Margaret walked down to check her mailbox. It was one of those perfect fall days, with crisp air and leaves turning gold and red. She loved this time of year. Robert had proposed to her on a day just like this 59 years ago. The mailbox was mostly full of junk mail and bills, like always. But there was one envelope that stood out. Heavy paper, expensive, her name and address written in elegant handwriting. Margaret carried it upstairs, curious. She settled into her worn armchair, the one Robert used to sit in, and opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a letter, handwritten on beautiful stationery. And a check. Margaret saw the amount and her hands started shaking. $50,000. The numbers seemed impossible. She set the check aside and read the letter with trembling fingers. The letter started with "Dear Margaret," and ended with profound gratitude. Victoria! In between, Victoria had poured out her heart. She wrote about that day 3 years ago, about how she'd been drowning in fear and pride, and Margaret's kindness had been a lifeline. About how she'd gone back to school, about how she'd become a social worker, about the nonprofit she'd started, helping women transition out of difficult situations. She wrote about the women they'd helped. Single mothers escaping abuse, elderly women facing homelessness after a spouse's death, young women rebuilding their lives after addiction. Hundreds of women over the past 2 years, each one getting a fresh start. She wrote about how every single one of those women existed because Margaret had shown her what real kindness looked like, what real wealth meant, what actually mattered in life. The letter said the check wasn't payment. You couldn't pay someone back for changing your entire life. It was a gift, a way to make sure Margaret's retirement was comfortable, a small way of saying thank you for a lesson that had been worth far more than any amount of money. Margaret read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. She thought about that moment at the grocery store, how she'd hesitated before pulling out her card, How she'd wondered if she was being foolish. How Jenny had worried about her winter coat money. That $47.83 had somehow multiplied into hundreds of women getting help. Into Victoria finding her purpose. Into this moment sitting in her chair, holding proof that kindness was never wasted. She called Victoria's number, which was written at the bottom of the letter. Her hands were shaking so much she had to dial twice. Victoria answered on the second ring. "Hello? Victoria? It's Margaret. I just got your letter." There was a pause, then Victoria's voice came through, thick with emotion. "Margaret, I wasn't sure if you'd remember me." "Remember you?" Margaret laughed through her tears. "Dear girl, how could I forget?" They talked for over an hour. Victoria told her about the nonprofit, about the women they were helping, about how Margaret's example had shaped everything they did. Margaret told her about retirement, about the community center, about how proud she was. "I can't accept this check," Margaret finally said. "It's too much." "Please," Victoria said. "Please accept it. You gave me so much more than money that day. You gave me direction, purpose, a reason to become better. This is nothing compared to what you gave me." "But $50,000 is less than what I would have spent on handbags and shoes in the years before I met you," Victoria said firmly. "Please, Margaret, let me do this. Let me make sure you're comfortable. You've earned it 1,000 times over." Margaret looked around her small apartment. The leaky faucet she couldn't afford to fix. The heater that barely worked. The thin carpet worn through in places. She thought about all the times she'd chosen between medication and groceries. Between new shoes and paying the electric bill. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." They made plans to meet for coffee that weekend. When Margaret hung up, she sat in silence for a long time, just holding that letter. Just processing the weight of what had happened. That evening, she called Jenny, her former co-worker who still checked on her regularly. "You're not going to believe this," Margaret said, and told her everything. Jenny screamed so loud Margaret had to hold the phone away from her ear. "This is amazing. This is like something from a movie. Oh, Maggie, I'm so happy I could cry." "I am crying," Margaret admitted, laughing. The next few days felt surreal. Margaret deposited the check, working with a very confused bank teller who kept double-checking the amount. She paid off her credit card. She called a plumber about the leak. She scheduled a doctor's appointment she'd been putting off for months, but mostly she thought about what to do with the rest of the money. She didn't need much. Her needs were simple. And this money had come from kindness, so it seemed right to use it for more kindness. When she met Victoria for coffee that Saturday, she had a proposal. "I want to do something at Riverside Grocery," she said. "A fund to help people who can't pay for their groceries. We could call it, I don't know, something about kindness." Victoria's eyes lit up. "The kindness counter," she said immediately. "Perfect." They spent weeks setting it up. The store management was thrilled. They created a fund where people could contribute, and cashiers could discreetly help customers who were short on money. No questions asked. No judgment. Just help. The fund started with $20,000 from Margaret's check. Victoria matched it with another $20,000. Soon other people started donating too, small amounts mostly, $5 here, $10 there. People who'd been helped and wanted to help others. Margaret went to the store for the launch event. It was strange being there as a guest instead of an employee, but it was wonderful too. She watched as the current staff learned about the fund, watched their faces light up at the idea of being able to help people without those people feeling ashamed. Jenny was there, now assistant manager. She hugged Margaret so tight she could barely breathe. "You did it, Maggie," she whispered. "You really did it. We all did it," Margaret corrected. "That's the thing about kindness. It spreads. One person starts and it ripples out, and before you know it, a whole community is changed." That night, exhausted but happy, Margaret sat in her armchair with a cup of tea. She thought about Robert and wished he could have seen this. He would have been so proud. He would have said something like, "That's my Maggie." Always finding ways to make the world a little brighter. She thought about the journey. From that rainy Thursday 3 years ago to this moment, how a single choice made in a moment of compassion had created this beautiful chain reaction. Her phone buzzed. A text from Victoria. Just a photo. 50 women, all smiling, all holding certificates from Victoria's nonprofit program. Women who'd completed job training. Women who'd found housing. Women who were rebuilding their lives. Below the photo, Victoria had written, "All because you showed me what matters. All because you chose kindness when you could have chosen anger. Thank you, Margaret, for everything." Margaret looked at those faces. 50 women, 50 lives changed. And that was just from Victoria's nonprofit. The kindness counter would help hundreds more. And those people would help others. And on, $47.83. That's all it had taken to start all of this. Such a small amount. Such a huge impact. Margaret fell asleep in her chair that night, her tea going cold, a smile on her face. She dreamed of Robert and of kindness rippling outward like stones thrown in a pond, the circles spreading wider and wider, touching shores she'd never even imagined. The months that followed were unlike anything Margaret had experienced in her 75 years. The kindness counter became more than just a fund at a grocery store. It became a movement, a reminder to people that small acts of compassion could change the world. Local newspapers wrote about it, then regional ones. A television station came to do a story. Margaret didn't want to be in front of the camera at first. She was just an ordinary woman who'd done an ordinary thing, but Victoria convinced her. "People need to see you," Victoria said gently. "They need to know that heroes don't wear capes. They wear polyester vests and sensible shoes. They show up to work every day and choose kindness over bitterness." So Margaret did the interview. She sat in her small living room, the one with the second-hand furniture and the faded wallpaper, and told the reporter about that rainy Thursday, about choosing to help someone who'd been unkind, about how she'd never expected anything in return. The reporter, a young woman named Lisa, had tears in her eyes by the end. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "When she was so rude to you, why did you still help?" Margaret thought about this for a moment. "Because hurting people hurt people," she said finally. "I could see she was in pain even if she couldn't see it herself yet. And I figured, maybe one act of unexpected kindness would help more than one act of justified anger." The interview aired on a Thursday evening. By Friday morning, the Kindness Counter Fund had received over $3,000 in donations from people Margaret had never met. By the end of the week, it was 10,000. People from across the state were sending checks, each one with a note. "This happened to me once, and a stranger helped. I want to be part of something good. My mother worked as a cashier her whole life. This is for her." The notes piled up on Margaret's kitchen table. She read every single one, often with tears in her eyes. Each note was a story. Each donation was someone saying, "Yes, kindness matters. Yes, I believe in this too." Victoria's nonprofit also exploded. Applications flooded in from women who needed help. Donations came from everywhere. They had to hire more staff, find a bigger building. Victoria was working 60-hour weeks, but Margaret had never seen her look happier. They met for lunch one Saturday, their coffee dates having evolved into regular meals. Victoria looked tired but radiant. "We're opening a second location," she said, barely able to contain her excitement. "In the next county. We've helped 230 women so far this year, Margaret. 230 lives changed." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You did that. You worked for it." "We did it," Victoria corrected. "You started it. That day at the store you planted a seed. And you grew it into something beautiful," Margaret said. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, eating their sandwiches. Then Victoria spoke again. "I want to do something special. For your birthday next month. You'll be 76, right?" Margaret nodded. "Just another day, really." "No," Victoria said firmly. "Not just another day. I want to do something meaningful." "Will you trust me?" Margaret smiled. "Always." Victoria's idea turned out to be bigger than Margaret ever imagined. On her 76th birthday, Victoria picked her up in the morning. They drove to Victoria's nonprofit center, where over 100 people were gathered, women from the program. Staff members, volunteers, donors. And in the front row, Jenny from the grocery store, crying before anything had even started. Victoria led Margaret to a chair at the front and handed her a gift. It was heavy, wrapped in simple brown paper. Margaret unwrapped it carefully, her arthritic hands moving slowly. Inside was a framed photograph. No, not just one photograph. It was a collage of hundreds of faces, women of all ages, all races, all backgrounds. And at the center, in elegant script, were the words, "Thank you, Margaret. You saved us. These are all the women we've helped," Victoria explained, her voice thick with emotion. Every single one. And below each photo they wrote what they wanted to say to you. Margaret looked closer. Tiny handwritten notes below each face. You showed someone kindness. She showed me kindness. Now I can show my daughter kindness. I didn't know people like you existed. Thank you for proving me wrong. Because of your example, I learned to help instead of judge. You saved my life without ever meeting me. Margaret couldn't stop the tears. They flowed freely down her weathered cheeks as she read note after note. All these lives, all these stories, all these people she'd never met, would never meet, but whose lives had been touched because she'd chosen compassion over resentment one rainy Thursday afternoon. Then, one by one, women stood up to speak. Each one shared their story. The single mother who'd escaped an abusive relationship, the elderly woman who'd been facing homelessness, the young woman who'd overcome addiction, the immigrant who'd found help navigating a new country. On and on, their stories wove together into a tapestry of hope and second chances, and they all ended the same way. Thank you, Margaret, for showing Victoria what kindness looks like. For showing all of us. Margaret was shaking. Jenny came up and held her hand. You okay, Maggie? Margaret nodded, unable to speak. How could she be anything but okay? This was everything. This was proof that her life had mattered, that her choice had mattered, that kindness always, always mattered. After the last woman spoke, Victoria stood up. Margaret, she said, her voice carrying across the quiet room, you gave me $47.83 worth of groceries. But what you really gave me was worth so much more. You gave me a new life, a purpose, a reason to be better. She pulled out another frame, smaller this time. I had this made for you. For your home. The frame contained a simple equation written in beautiful calligraphy, 4783. Infinite ripples below. It was a quote. Kindness is never wasted. It simply waits for the right moment to bloom. Margaret stood up, shaky but determined. She looked at all these faces, all these lives, all this hope, and she spoke from her heart. I'm just an old cashier, she said, her voice soft but clear. I never did anything special. I just chose to help when I could. That's all any of us can do. Choose kindness when we have the chance. Choose compassion over judgment. Choose love over anger. She looked at Victoria. But here's what I've learned from all of this. Kindness isn't a one-way street. When I helped Victoria that day, I thought I was the one giving. But she gave me so much more in return. She gave me hope. She gave me proof that goodness exists. She gave me this. Margaret gestured to the room, to all the people gathered. This community, this love. This reminder that we're all in this together. That's the real gift. She wiped her eyes. Robert, my late husband, used to say that people are like gardens. You can choose to plant flowers or weeds. Every interaction is a seed. Every word is water. Every action is sunshine or shadow. And what you plant, you eventually harvest. She smiled through her tears. I planted a tiny seed that day. Just a small act of kindness. But Victoria, oh Victoria, she took that seed and grew an entire forest. And now all of you, you're growing forests too. That's the magic of kindness. It multiplies. It spreads. One person starts and suddenly the whole world is blooming. The room erupted in applause. Women stood up, crying, hugging each other, hugging Margaret. It was chaos and beauty and love all mixed together. Later, after the celebration, after the cake and the tears and the photographs, Victoria drove Margaret home. They sat in the car outside Margaret's apartment building, neither one wanting the day to end. I keep thinking about what you said, Victoria murmured, about planting seeds. You planted kindness in me when I was at my worst, when I deserved it least. That's when people need it most, Margaret said. When they deserve it least. That's when kindness has the most power. Victoria turned to face her. Do you ever regret it? That money? What you gave up? Margaret laughed, a full, joyful sound. Regret it? Dear girl, it was the best investment I ever made. $47.83 bought me all of this. This friendship. This community. This proof that love wins. That's worth more than all the money in the world. They hugged goodbye and Margaret made her way upstairs to her apartment. The same small apartment, though it was warmer now with the new heater. The same simple furniture, though there were new photos on the walls now. Pictures of Victoria. Pictures of the women from the nonprofit. Pictures of the kindness counter launch. Margaret hung her new birthday gift on the wall opposite her chair. The collage of faces, the infinite ripples. She sat down and looked at it for a long time. She thought about her life. 76 years of choosing kindness over bitterness, of showing up, of doing her best with what she had. She'd never been rich. She'd never been famous. She'd just been Margaret, a cashier, a wife, a friend, a human being trying to make the world a little bit better. And it had been enough, more than enough. Her phone buzzed. A text from Jenny. I used the kindness counter today for the first time. A young mom with 3 kids came through my line. She was short by $12. You should have seen her face when I told her it was covered. She cried, Maggie. She hugged me and cried. It felt amazing. Margaret smiled and texted back. That's the feeling. Hold on to it, share it, pass it on. More texts came in throughout the evening. From Victoria, from women at the nonprofit, from the store manager at Riverside Grocery, from people she'd met through this journey. All of them sharing stories, all of them passing on kindness. As the sun set and her apartment grew dark, Margaret didn't turn on the lights right away. She just sat there in the comfortable darkness feeling grateful, not for the money, not for the recognition, but for the reminder that her life had purpose, that her choices mattered, that kindness was never ever wasted. She thought about all the people who'd ever told her she was too soft, too kind, too willing to give, all the people who'd said she should look out for herself first. All the people who'd treated kindness like weakness. They were wrong. Kindness wasn't weakness. Kindness was strength. It was courage. It was choosing to help when walking away would be easier. It was choosing to love when hatred would be simpler. It was choosing to see the humanity in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. Before bed, Margaret wrote in her journal, something she'd started doing after Robert died. She wrote about the day, about the faces in the photograph, about the women whose lives had changed, about the ripples spreading out from one small act of compassion. And then she wrote something that would become famous when Victoria published it years later, after Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep at age 82. Today I learned that kindness is the only thing that multiplies by dividing. The more you give it away, the more of it there is in the world. I gave away $47.83. I got back everything that matters: love, purpose, hope, proof that we're all connected, that we all matter, that we all have the power to change lives with simple acts of compassion. If I could go back to that rainy Thursday and choose again, I'd make the same choice 1,000 times. Because that's what kindness is. Not a transaction, not an investment, not a calculated risk, just a choice. The choice to see someone else's pain and respond with love instead of judgment. The choice to help instead of hurt. The choice to be the person the world needs more of. That's all. That's everything. In the years that followed, the kindness counter expanded to 50 grocery stores. Victoria's nonprofit helped thousands of women. Margaret's story was shared around the world. And countless people, inspired by an elderly cashier who chose compassion over resentment, went out and planted their own seeds of kindness. All because one woman on one rainy Thursday decided that helping someone who didn't deserve it was more important than being right. That kindness mattered more than pride. That love was always worth the cost. And in the end, isn't that what all of us are looking for? A reminder that we matter, that our choices count, that even the smallest acts of goodness can change the world. That one person, choosing love in a moment when hatred would be easier, can start a revolution of compassion that ripples out forever. Margaret taught us that, not with grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices, but with $47.83, with a smile at a grocery store register, with the simple, profound choice to plant flowers instead of weeds. That's the real story. Not about money or recognition or reward, but about the quiet, powerful truth that kindness is never wasted.